Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Trident Talks. My name is McNaughton and I'm one of the consultants here at Trident Search. This is the second episode of the series of myself speaking to sales engineering leaders. Today, I am very grateful to be joined by Clive McDonald. Clive, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Sam. Pleasure to be here.
So the purpose of this episode is very much going into hiring a sales engineering team. What does a sales engineering team look like? And from a C-suite standpoint and a leadership standpoint, how do you go about hiring them? What do you look for? So I thought we'd kind of start off by talking about you, Clive. Kind of go into your background. How did you get into a leadership position within a pre-sales? And how do you find those positions yourself?
Okay, so with myself, I've got probably is not even the operative word, definitely. I've got over a decade of experience in sales engineering, coming from the ground up. Historically, I came from a network security type of background, very common dynamic with my age group. So I just naturally evolved into the role through many scars and battles through my career. So I've been doing this particular role or leadership role for probably about 8 of those years now. And I've just naturally evolved. There isn't a direct path into going into that type of field. It's just generally through osmosis to a large degree.
Yeah, so you very much started from kind of an IC standpoint.
I did indeed.
Days, and then you got promoted internally into that head of position.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly how it went. So it was an evolutionary. It was like, amoeba, lizard, a monkey, and then me. It was literally a kind of scenario where I started as an engineer, progressed in my engineering career into a consultant, became a senior consultant, and then evolved accordingly to lead a team. And then that team grew. I was tasked to grow teams across EMEA, and that's where my expertise lie. And I kind of evolved accordingly.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we're growing across EMEA is kind of a big topic at the moment. There's a lot of companies in the US that wanting to grow into EMEA. So from yourself, someone's done it successfully in the past. How did you kind of grow those teams? What was your approach to growing those teams?
Initially, it wasn't a deliberate thing. Again, it was an evolutionary thing. But now, after a degree of experience across a whole raft of different US startups and actually landing in the trenches, as it were, usually the beachhead is within the UK. That's the usual start of the dynamic. If you're talking about a new startup coming from maybe the States or Israel or wherever that may be, and then you would normally evolve into Northern Europe, possibly because it's quite a relatively accepting market. Myself coming from a cloud space, and that being the market that I originally, cut my teeth on, as it were. Generally, those markets are slightly more mature and more accepting of new technologies. Now, with that being said, that kind of drives the sales dynamic, which then in turn pulls the sales engineering teams and the resources required to establish, those footholds in those regions. So that's the natural dynamic. With regards to what I look for in an engineer or what I look for as a team, that to a degree is dictated by the technology. But also, we need to be tightly in lockstep with the sales team and their aspirations and what they're trying to achieve within region, because each region within EMEA is distinct in and of itself, as we know, right? And there are some slightly different nuances with regards to the talent that you bring on board, depending on the region that you're in. But first things first, from my perspective, always good to start with somebody with a leadership mentality. And when I mean a leadership mentality, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to lead teams or going to be VPs or directors of engineering or whatever, but they need to be self-starters and self-motivators in and of themselves. That's the first thing I look for. And then obviously there's a whole raft of technical aptitudes and a whole raft of other things that you need to talk to, but those would be the starters for 10, as it were.
Yeah, and do you find that's a specific quality to look for in a person, that to have that startup experience, to be able to be those first boots on the ground, that's an individual characteristic that you would look for within someone?
It's a must-have, ultimately. If you're, I mean, the key's in the term, first boot on the ground. The first boot on the ground, sometimes you're landing on that ground without a lot of, back-end support, right?
Yeah.
So you have to be self-motivated and being able to take the initiative as part of the course. And that's a natural dynamic. Now, if you're looking at a larger enterprise that's established within region, you might be looking for a more siloed, well, siloed is the wrong term, a more specialized, segmented skill set. Right, because you've got the luxury of the support system to support that dynamic. But if you're talking about it from a startup point of view, that's a luxury you generally might not have. So
yeah, okay, and then it's very much just building off that one person there, going where else can you support that person? Do you find it's dependent on that how that person gets on, or can you approach it in more of a general approach in terms of when you start to recruit other people into the team?
Where I would start, if I'm thinking about the first engineer on the ground within region, I'm going to be looking for somebody who's going to be running their business, because that's the way I want them to look at that geography. Right. Ultimately, wherever they are, let's just take, DAC as an example. And you're the first sales engineer that I hire in DAC. I'll be looking for you to take that on as your own regional business, with a view that you're going to grow it to such an extent that you'll be leading your own team or evolving out of that role eventually, right? That's the kind of individual I'll be looking for. Wouldn't really be ideal for a really junior person because of the nature of the beast that you're trying to attack there.
Okay, so very much looking at that specific person in that situation, and kind of building on that and how they can kind of help the company. I mean, what do you see kind of as an impact of that person? Obviously, they have a massive impact because they are the first person and the first boots. But
yeah,
what would you put down? How big of an impact do they have on that region and the company as a whole? I would say.
I'm looking at it from my point, without blowing my own trumpet, brushing the dirt off my shoulder, as it were. It's the difference with that company, and we're talking about software sales, right? Whether it be software technical sales within the region. If we're talking about that can be the difference between that region being successful and it not being successful. It's as simple as that, right? Because no matter how good or great the software may be, and no matter how great the actual individual sellers may be within region, if you're looking to break the ice within that region, your sales engineer is key to that success, right? And if you are the first engineer within region, you end up being a jack of many trades, right? Your product management, because you're an interface to the mothership, as it were. Your field engineering, so you're actually in some cases out there in the ground, in the trenches, deploying and helping your customers with the deployment of that software. You're also, you're not only serving the customer, you've got internal customers between your sales teams, your inside sales teams, your product management, your marketing. You're doing a lot of different things and you're wearing many hats. So you've got to have the appetite to do that. If you're really looking to just be a straight up and down sales engineer, that's all I want to do. Really basically focus on deploying the environment, going through POCs and so on. That's a luxury for a larger organization, of which, I've worked in many. But that's a further evolution and a far more mature organization than being the first few individuals on the ground.
It's wearing many hats, but then also being able to manage different, parts of the business, being able to work as a whole team on that go-to-market sector instead of it just being a sales engineer doing your bog standard,
absolutely
demo, things like that. It's very much a whole team aspect instead of it just being a single player.
And that's the key, team, right? And I know that's a bit of a trite term, but really you've got to be the kind of individual that thrives off of that type of dynamic. Now, that's what I'll be looking for. That's what the business generally more often than not will be looking for. And then as things, progress and mature, you can start to specialize and focus on your day job. Never forget your day job. This is, you're hired to be a sales engineer, absolutely. But you shouldn't balk at the prospect of, having to multitask to a degree.
100%. So when you come to hire them, what does that kind of process look like for you?
Okay, so I'm quite structured in the way that I like to look at things as far as hiring is concerned. So, outside of the initial, somebody as illustrious as yourself will do the first screening type of dynamic. So ideally, if we're not going direct and, we're leveraging your expertise as an example, I would set out a set of criteria of what I'm looking for, the type of individual, type of skill set. I'll give you a whole litany of requirements. I would put must-haves, nice to have, and then, it would be an additional cherry on the top, as it were, around the requirements of that individual. Once you've passed through that gate, yourself being that gate, ideally, I would have a scenario where they'd speak to me, or they'd speak to another team member who I deem to be senior, depending on the evolution of the organization, right? Another team member. And then once they've passed that initial taste test, I would go through a board review, right? So would have couple of people within regions, maybe a salesperson within that region, myself, and would have a raft of, highlighted, personality fit questions, as it were, to make sure that you're a right personality type of fit for that particular team set, right? And then would go through a technical test. And then, I would, assuming that you've passed all of those hurdles, and this can be in a day or two, right? So we're not talking about multiple sessions because everybody gets tired of that, right? But ultimately, I'll try to condense these requirements into a few days, and then the final hurdle will be to get sign off from maybe if I'm the regional VP within region, then it would be myself or a subordinate, or if they may have to go up the chain, as it were, to get a final sign off, maybe from the mothership, wherever that may be, whether it's the US or locally here in the UK.
Yes, so very much trying to say it as a short process. I mean, there's a lot of organisations now that we kind of see, and when I speak to candidates, they're kind of saying, I'm having 5, 6, 7 different stages going through with, multiple different tests. So from your point of view, a hiring process shouldn't be much longer than, say, 1 or 2 weeks at max, given the availability.
Absolutely.
Stages very, very quickly going through it.
If a hiring process has failed if you go past 10 days.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's the long end, right? If you can condense things down to a week, then great. But then you have to have all your ducks in a line, right? Because calendars notwithstanding, availability, all of those things come into play. But ideally, you should be looking at a week to 10 days. Now, there may be many gates involved in those 10 days or that week time frame, but suffice to say, it shouldn't be a longer process. And it's the nature of the beast nowadays, right? Back in the day when I was a lad, you could go in, somebody will like the cut of your jib, and you'll have the job, in the course of 2 interviews or a single interview. But we're a little bit more deliberate nowadays with our hiring, so you cut your cloth accordingly.
Yeah. So for yourself, then, how early in the process would you be able to kind of see that a candidate would be the right fit? We always say, kind of from our point of view, from a recruitment agency, that you want to have more than one interview. You'd never have just one, because you want to make sure it's the right fit for the candidate, and you want to make sure it's the right fit culturally for the company. But from your point of view, how early on from speaking to someone would you be able to go, actually, they're a really good fit for the company, I could see them fitting in here well?
Me personally, personal experience, 2 to 3 interviews. 2 to 3 interviews, I can get a good gist, right? And then, depending on the technology in question, right, and the complexity of the technology, I may want to have the technical interview before I get to the panel interview, right? Yeah. It really depends on the dynamic of the technology. But either way, I'm going to assume you'll pass the technical test. I know assumption is the mother of all, but that notwithstanding, my expectation is that we would have filtered out the flotsam and jetsam to such a degree that we only get technically capable candidates, and then it's really about personality and aptitude and all of those softer dynamics.
Yeah, it very much. Of course, it depends on every single hiring manager. Every hiring manager's got, a different view on the market, different things that they're going to want to look for. If very technical, if it's a new product, then there's going to be a lot more of that technical aspect. Are they going to be able to understand it and learn it, instead of it being, more of a generic, let's say a firewall, for example, if you're selling
exactly.
If you've sold them before, maybe that technical aspect isn't there. So, what kind of are your thoughts on the market at the moment then, from both kind of looking at it from a recruitment standpoint and seeing where kind of the market's tipped in, say, the past 12 months, where last year there was all these roles to now where actually it is kind of the opposite, and there's not as many roles per se, but there's more candidates. What kind of your thoughts on that?
I think it's like all things, it's seasonal, right? We're going through autumn, winter kind of period right now, right? And because of a whole raft of geopolitical factors, which I won't go into, but we all know what they are, a lot of people are at loose ends right now, right? There's been a lot of layoffs, so there's a lot of resources and people looking for different roles. There's been a lot of changes. There's been a lot of geographical changes with regards to where people start up organizations within EMEA now, right? So a lot of those things come into play. But all of that notwithstanding, that specifically within the security and analytics space, there is a shortage of expertise to this day, right? Now, sifting through, the individual candidates and you positioning yourselves in a really meaningful way is the only way you can really start to think about actually, pulling the diamonds out of the dearth of individuals and candidates that are out there. So with that being said, putting yourself out, making sure that your interview technique is pretty much on point. You're forthright. If you depending on your field, if you're writing documentation or blogs or vlogs, as it were, making sure that your profile's out there is, only a good thing, right? But as I say, it's seasonal. This, in this moment will pass, and when it passes, we'll go back to, feast and famine, that kind of dynamic. So
it swings and roundabouts, really, isn't it? You kind of touched there about getting your profile out. How big of a thing is LinkedIn for yourself when you come to hiring someone? Do you look at their LinkedIn? Does it play a big part?
It's not going to be my guiding light. And I know some people might slap me in my head with regards to that, but it's not my guiding light because everybody has a different dynamic. Some people post on LinkedIn every day as if they are on, Instagram or Facebook or whatever. Other people, do it, once in a blue moon, right? That is no indication as to how great those individuals are, right? So I won't use that as my guiding light, but it's always a good place to go because when you want to, let's be honest here, when I speak to somebody, you jump on LinkedIn to see who they know that I know, right? Yeah. And if it's somebody who's close enough to me, then I'll, they'll whisper in here, how's this guy? How is he? Is he all right? Is he? Maybe not. And then, you frame your opinion. You don't let that be the only opinion that you have, but it's just the nature of the beast, right?
An aspect of it. Okay, fantastic. Well, look, I think that wraps up the end of this episode. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you, Sam. Hopefully
really it was for those trying to get into the industry, whether or not they kind of see what you look for in a sales engineer and how they kind of get into it and what that process looks like and what they can expect. So thank you very, very much for your time.
Appreciate that, Sam. Appreciate that.